You're on.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kai Bird. I'm the executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography that is hosting this event virtually. We used to do this, of course, in person at CUNY Graduate Center, and now we do it around the world on Crowdcast. We have 10 events coming up this autumn, so please check your website, the Leon Levy Center for Biography website, to see our schedule. Our next event is going to be with Eddie Glaude on his biography discussion of James Baldwin. And he'll be in conversation with Nicholas Boggs, who's one of our Leon Levy biography fellows this coming year. We have with us tonight a fabulous conversation in store between a former Leon Levy fellow, Samanth Subramanian, a wonderful gentleman and scholar and fabulous writer, the author now of 3 books. He is a most patient biographer. He was very quick to write this book, but when he was my fellow, he showed up from India and London, and for some reason, we couldn't pay him because I think he didn't have an American passport. And the university bureaucracy just was horrible. But Samanth was like impossible to discourage. He was so patient and a real gentleman, as I said, until we could figure out how to pay the poor man. Anyway, he's also a wonderful writer of science, writing for Wired and The Guardian. I recommend his recent journalism on the pandemic. It's some of the best writing I've seen about the pandemic. And we're here to discuss his new biography of JBS Haldane called A Dominant Character, The Radical Science and Restless Politics of JBS Haldane. In discussion with Samanth is Carl Zimmer, the fabulous New York Times reporter who reports on science. Carl is the author of 13 books, all about science, and his next book is coming out in March of 21 called Life's Edge, The Search for What It Means to Be Alive. His columns are in the New York Times every week, and both he and Samanth are two of the few writers who really explain science in plain English to the common reader and bring science alive. And so I'm delighted to have them both here tonight. This event will go on they'll have a conversation for about 40, 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And you can type in a question on your screen, and we've already got 6 logged in there. We have an audience of over 100 people now, and at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Carl to interrogate Samanth. Thank you, Carl.
My pleasure. Thank you, Kai. Hi, Samanth. I thought maybe for people who aren't familiar with Haldane, I might refresh their memory a bit in the sense that people who may not know who Haldane was may probably have heard some of his words. You know, he seems to me like an incredibly quotable scientist. I went to the Goodreads quote page for JBS Haldane and noted my favorite ones. I think a lot of people have heard about when Haldane was asked if God existed, and he said something along the lines of, if he did, he has an inordinate fondness for Beatles. He's also the guy who said the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can. The universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. I also like this one. Man armed with science is like a baby with a box of matches. And really my all-time favorite one from an amazing essay called On Being the Right Size is, you can drop a mouse down a 1,000-yard mine shaft, and on arriving at the bottom, it gets a slight shock and walks away, provided that the ground is fairly soft. A rat is killed, a man is broken, a horse splashes. So he was one of those scientists who was also a wonderful writer. But even though, I mean, as your book shows, he was arguably the most famous scientist in the mid 1900s in Britain, known around the world, I don't think enough people know about him today. And I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about the Haldane's life and how you bring us into it, and just how remarkable he was, because he it's such a, I think it's so unfortunate that people have forgotten him, because he's so relevant to today. And before we start, actually, like, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you got interested in writing a biography of him. I mean, was Haldane somebody that you had known of for a while?
Well, I mean, I guess the most natural way for anybody who was living in India or from India to learn about Haldane is to learn about him backwards, to learn about his move to India in 1957, the fact that he became an Indian citizen. He died there in 1964. So I knew all this, and it was obviously sort of a step further to want to know why he moved to India in the first place, at a time when usually the movement of the scientists and other scholars was in the opposite direction, east to west, so to speak. And the first thing I did was, of course, read the basic outline of his life. I read another older biography of his that's not very robustly written, but anybody can go to the Wikipedia page for JBS Haldane today, and I challenge them to not be immediately fascinated by the barest outlines of his life. I mean, leave the science aside for a minute. This is a man who, as a boy, was the son of a scientist who experimented on himself and experimented on his son, on the young JBS. This is a boy who became a man in the trenches in World War I, not only enjoying the war, but eventually going on to write his first scientific paper in the trenches. This is a man who challenged the authorities at Cambridge over a divorce scandal. This is a man who went to Spain during the Civil War, who experimented on himself during the Second World War, was thought to be a spy by the British intelligence services. And, arguably the most memorable episode of his life is the one that I start the book with, which is this sort of big gamble of science and politics that he took in defending a Soviet scientist named Trofim Lysenko, this big inflection point in his life. And all of this to me seemed, not like the kind of stories about scientists that we hear these days at all. I mean, scientists are relatively more sober these days. Nobody's experimenting on themselves, unless you count the microbiologist out in California who drank peptic ulcer bacteria to make sure that he did get ulcers, Heliobacter pylori. Him aside, there's not that many cases right now where you use your own body as a test subject. But beyond that, I thought these themes of science and politics and how they intersect and how political a figure a scientist actually is, I thought all of this was enormously relevant back in 2015 when I started doing this book. And, perhaps to my fortune, but to the world's misfortune, unfortunately, scientists have been called upon to become even more political over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, as we've seen these huge manipulations of truth and fact dominate the public sphere. And we can talk about that much later. But the simple answer to your question is, it's just, the sheer drama and adventure of his life, attracted me to him in the first place.
Yeah. And on top of all of that, he also somehow managed to do incredibly influential work in evolutionary biology and physiology, the origin of life. There's so much to talk about on just the side of him being a scientist, as well as just having this larger than life biography. So, well, maybe we could, maybe we could start just by talking about how he became a scientist. So, as you say, his father was a scientist. He grew up around science. Did he always know he wanted to be a scientist, or was it only after World War I? Or how did that come about?
It's funny. I think science and mathematics in particular came very easily to him. But he was also sort of enormously well read. He was clearly sort of extremely intelligent and absorbent of everything he read. So when he finished school at Eton, he went to Oxford to study not math, but the classics. And he eventually ended up earning a first in the classics. He studied no scientific subjects at all for his degree at Oxford. He's one of those rare non-scientist scientists.
Maybe
And I
why?
think he went, and an excellent writer. I mean, extremely well read in the classics, as I said, knew how to build an argument, a fluent writer even when he was in school. And my theory is sort of obviously his father's influence is extreme. He's grown up in a house with a lab in the backyard, so he really has been immersed in science from the very first years of his life. But I think he went away to the First World War. He wasn't in the first attack of gas warfare that the Germans unleashed, but he was certainly close enough that he saw the mixing of science and warfare. He saw also the manipulation of science and by bureaucrats, how bureaucrats were unable or unwilling to implement the best advice of scientists like his father. And I think all of this really had quite a serious sort of impact on him, which is why when he came back from the war in 1918, he went to Oxford and he read in biochemistry and not in the classics, which is what he was trained to do. This was still a time when you could do that, when you could still sort of go and be a scientist in a university, even though you'd never studied it formally at the university level.
Mm. And he's one of some of the things he's best known for is his amazing work on with genetics at a time when genetics was just getting off the ground, and he had some incredible insights, and then which sort of extended into just conceiving of evolution in basically the modern way that we do. What drew him to genetics, and then how did what was his path into evolution?
Well, so I think he was growing up in the earliest years of the 1900s at a time when the rediscovery of Mendel's work was just sort of blooming. There were scientists in the US and in the UK who were working on Mendelian genetics for the very first time. They were trying to draw the most rudimentary maps of the chromosome, of any chromosome, including the fruit fly chromosome up in Colombia. And, all these papers were coming out while he was just sort of finding his feet as a student of mathematics. And I think he found quite early that there was a space for mathematics in genetics. And so he went on to develop that. But let's step back a second and kind of think about the space that genetics and evolution occupied in the early 1900s. I mean, the big divide was between what you might call the Mendelians on the one hand and the Darwinians on the other. So the Mendelians, who, based on Mendel's work, had decided that there were these units of inheritance called genes. And, a change in a gene would spur a change in the physiology or the physical sort of appearance, the physical character of an organism. And they always saw these changes as sort of big, discrete changes, possibly binary changes as well. So is the surface of a pea wrinkled or is it smooth? That was one of the classic examples. And the Darwinians, on the other hand, following Darwin, believed that changes were small and continuous. They would accumulate over time and eventually sort of lead to speciation. And there was seemingly no way to sort of bridge these two divides. It was complicated further by the fact that Darwin's own theory for how inheritance happened, that had been disproven, but there was still no way to yoke Darwinian natural selection to Mendelian genetics. And I think Haldane's sort of biggest contribution, and it wasn't just Haldane, it was Haldane and a couple of other people, but the so-called modern synthesis of these two schools of thought involved proving how powerful natural selection could be, even if the changes in the genome were small and continuous. Mm-hmm. And this involved a whole lot of math. It involved sort of passing through various kinds of natural selection scenarios, accounting for strong selection, weak selection, and so on. But I think at the end of, or the towards sort of the mid 1930s, the late 1930s, Haldane had definitively proven the power of natural selection at the level of the gene. And I think in doing that, he kind of resurrected Darwinism, which, in the early 1900s and the 1910s was thought to be on its deathbed.
Yeah.
So I think that is sort of primarily what evolutionary biologists remember Haldane for. There's a whole lot of other stuff as well,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
his role in the modern synthesis is just is crucial.
I mean, I think it's easy to overlook just how important that realization was. I mean, I was thinking about how right now in the pandemic, one of the most important things that biologists are doing is they're looking at the genome of this virus, and they're trying to figure out, well, how did it mutate from a bat virus into a human virus, and is it continuing to evolve? And they can see that happening on a molecular level, the way Haldane could only envision with his mathematical mind. But
Right.
we're fighting the pandemic with Haldane's ideas, really. It's just happening all around us.
I think that's right. And I think, once Haldane and Fisher and Wright, the other two scientists who worked on this, once they kind of planted natural selection deeply back into the soil, there was never a danger that it would be uprooted again. I think that was sort of the last point of instability for Darwinian natural selection, and Haldane helped make sure that it never went anywhere after that.
I was wondering, there was a lot of the role of genetics and evolution in the early 1900s was in society was very complicated and fraught. A lot of early geneticists were, just flat out eugenicists, and they saw genetics as basically a way of understanding how we could make humans better. And some of them didn't mind if we sterilized people. So did Haldane have views on eugenics? I mean, I would imagine, as he was this staunch leftist and communist, that it wouldn't really agree well with him. But, there were so many geneticists who were just out and out eugenicists at the time.
Right. I think Haldane's views and his allegiances towards the left solidified over time, and certainly towards the middle of his life and towards the end of his life, he was as confirmed an opponent of eugenics as we understand it as there was around. He was one of the foremost campaigners against Nazi science, the so-called theory of race science that the Nazis put out. But, when he was a boy and a young man, I think he did inherit a lot of the prejudices that were in society around him. And you can see that in some of his writing. I mean, he automatically conflates sort of levels of technological achievement, for example, with, the abilities of civilizations or racial societies to ever progress beyond a certain point. There's a degree of lazy stereotyping. But even there, Haldane is sort of he's always clear quite early on, in a way that many scientists weren't, that this whole business of genetics and what kind of effect the genome has on our abilities or our appearance, it's all a lot more complex than we can, hope to figure out even now, let alone back in the early 1900s. And I think a lot of the other scientists at the time were very quick to jump to the fact that the genome must determine everything about a person, the intelligence, the moral character, fitness in a non-Darwinian sense. And I think Haldane always cautioned against that from the very beginning. So in that sense, I think he was wary of eugenics. And he certainly spoke out all the time against the sterilization campaigns in the US. He spoke out against the British government's attempts to sequester people whom they deemed mentally or physically unfit. All this was sort of in the speeches that he gave in London and around England beginning in the 1920s.
So in the 1920s, he's becoming famous. He really shoots up to celebrity status. Like, people are following the salacious details of his divorce and things like that. I mean, how did he get to be so famous? This person who does, doing these experiments in this, what seems like obscure mathematics.
Well, I mean, one reason is, what we talked about at the very beginning, which is he's just an endlessly quotable guy. He really knows sort of how to turn a phrase, how to make that phrase stick in someone's mind. So he's a good speaker, But he wrote this tract in the early 1920s called Daedalus, and Daedalus was this stunt of backwards prophecy. It basically involves a student of the future looking back across the course of the late 20th and 21st centuries and kind of describing all these developments that have happened. And in doing so, Haldane sort of really set down a kind of manifesto for the importance of the scientist in the public sphere. He calls the biologist the new Daedalus of the future. The fact that the biologist will be the most critical, crucial figure in scientific and technological establishments around the world, because that is the most exciting, innovative science that's happening at the time. And it was such a, he followed that up with a couple of other essays, and these were all such, clearly aimed so cleverly at the general public that these books started to sell out. They would fly off the shelves. And Haldane, who had until then kind of resisted being an explainer of science to the layman and the laywoman, he suddenly found that he started to relish this kind of celebrity, and he continued to write for the lay audiences until his death.
Mm. Well, and then you mentioned that Daedalus piece. I mean, maybe hindsight is 2020, but like it's such a visionary work. I mean, the things that he's thinking about that might happen in the future, in some cases have happened. And I mean, I think a lot in terms of biotechnology. He could see that, by work, as they were beginning to work out the nature of genes, he could, and just physiology, he was saying we're going to be able to harness living things at a level that no one has been able to imagine before.
Right, and specific predictions that he makes that are most famous. I mean, the most famous prediction to come out of that is sort of the equivalent of the test tube baby, essentially. Babies grown in boxes. That Aldous Huxley, an idea that Huxley borrowed for A Brave New World. But less, famously, there's the example that I always like to cite of peak oil and peak coal. I mean, this was not at all a field that he was supposed to be conversant with. This is not biology. But he eventually foresaw that there will be a time at which oil production and coal production will peak, beyond which it is unprofitable to keep mining these resources out of the earth. He envisioned sort of big wind farms, hydrogen farms that would power the earth. I mean, all of these things that we're talking about right now, he saw 100 years ago.
Yeah. And then there was, I'd mentioned The Origin of Life before. So I guess it was in, I think 1929, right? When he wrote this piece about just thinking off the top of his head about how life might have originated. And I mean, it's, there were other people who were independently thinking along these lines, like Oparin, but you read Haldane talking about the origin of life and just musing about, well, the Earth probably wasn't like it is now, and here's some chemistry and how I think it might work. You're like, it lays out what a whole bunch of scientists right now are doing, and I mean, it seems like it just came out of nowhere. I mean, it's just, did he just sit down one day and just start musing about it?
It really seems like it, because I mean, the thing to note is that paper isn't a scientific paper in the way that we know it. This is not something that is based on research. It doesn't have citations. It's an essay. It's an essay written, I believe, for sort of just a regular publication. He starts off with a whole bunch of guff about the creation of life before he actually gets down to the chemistry and the physics of it. And he lays out this model about how he was the first to use the word soup, as we always do these days, the primordial soup of nutrients. How ultraviolet light might react with these chemicals in this soup, what the atmosphere has to be like in a primitive earth for the basic building blocks of life to emerge. I mean, he sort of tossed all of this out off the top of his head. And 30 odd years later, we have the famous Miller-Urey experiment, where somebody did actually, in a flask in a lab, set up a similar model to Haldane's hypothesis, pass a bolt of electricity through it, and lo and behold, all these amino acids spring into existence exactly as Haldane predicted. And so, I mean, he was often like this. I mean, it almost seemed as if he was, like a Catherine wheel sort of throwing sparks off. He was just like shedding ideas all over the place.
Mm-hmm. So we talked a little bit about his sort of awakening in terms of leftist politics and communism. I mean, could you talk a little, sir, more specifically about that? I mean, he ends up in Spain during the Civil War. So what was that thread of his life like?
Well, I mean, even that, I suppose you could trace back to his childhood and to the fact that his father, who was a scientist, clearly had this intense belief that science had to be used for the benefit of society. So he would often go out and talk to coal miners and deep sea divers from the Navy and people who lived in unventilated housing and schools. And, he would try to make their conditions better. And I think Haldane really saw this as a model for how science ought to work, but more than anything else, he saw these aspects of society, these sections of society that many other people from his background would not have been exposed to at all. And then he goes away to the trenches in the First World War, and he again meets a whole bunch of men from completely different backgrounds, gets along with them far better than he did with the toffs at Eton. And he comes back sort of, I think, a changed man with a real sympathy for the working class in England and elsewhere. And gradually he keeps drifting leftwards. He marries, his first wife was an affirmed socialist when she met him. And so I think they kind of radicalized each other further. And then by the 1930s, as Nazi Germany comes into being and there's all this talk of fascism in the air, he generally sees socialism and then communism as the most serious counterweight to fascist politics. And, although he was a fellow traveler for most of the late 1930s, I think he joined the party only in the early 1940s. When he went to Spain during the Civil War to help the Republicans fight Franco's fascists, I think by then he'd already made his choice. He was already sort of a confirmed fellow traveler.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But when he comes back to Britain, I mean, in World War II, he's very much like, again, the most famous scientist in the country, and he's trying to do things to help in the war effort. I mean, and for one thing, you write about he realizes that they need bomb shelters. How did that come about?
Well, I mean, it's the parallels with today are just sort of so resonant. I mean, and we can talk about that later. But here's a situation in which Haldane, who has always believed that the governments of the West are sort of in cahoots with power structures and capitalist power structures in particular, to the extent that they will sometimes favor those power structures over the well-being of the general public. So he's always believed this, or at least for the last 15 or 20 years. And then here comes a situation in which the Blitz has begun in London. The Luftwaffe is bombing London regularly. And the government has come up with what they call a bomb shelter, an Anderson shelter. And what is an Anderson shelter? An Anderson shelter is something you can buy from the government for not much money, admittedly, but then you are sort of supposed to half embed it in your garden. And so the presumption here is that you have a garden. And Haldane could not see the wisdom of this at all. I mean, because how many people in England then or now have a garden to embed their shelter into? And if you don't have a garden, if you're just sort of leaning the shelter against the back wall of your house or crowding into it with multiple people, it is a very unsafe place to be in. And so Haldane's idea was that there must be ways to build better, safer shelters that would take in the working classes just as much as the rich. And he designed one of these himself based on his experiences in Spain. And he tried to get the government to look at the plans for these shelters. He argued the economics of it. He pointed out that cement was not as expensive as the government claimed because there was a cement cartel or a cement lobby that was driving up prices at that point. And all they had to do was break that cartel and you could build all the Haldane shelters you wanted. It never came to pass. I mean, I think the most that happened was that a couple of councils around the country raised money to build it themselves. But by that time, the Blitz had passed. And so there were no Haldane shelters built anyway. But this is a classic example, I think, of what Haldane believed about the merging of politics and science and capitalist society in a way that withheld the benefits of science from the people who really needed them.
Mm-hmm. Now, you had mentioned that we mentioned earlier at the beginning of your book, you talk about his interactions with Stalinist Russia and in particular with Lysenko. And for people who aren't familiar with Lysenko, this was a scientist who came to thrive under Stalin and had basically was feeding Stalin pseudoscientific claims that sort of accorded with the way Stalin wanted to hear things about dismissing genetics and was promising Stalin all this wheat, these great wheat harvests based on Lysenkoism. So, and for scientists outside of the Soviet Union, this was a real difficult thing to reckon with, and to see their Russian colleagues being pushed into this very extreme political situation. In some cases, some people being executed. So, as a committed communist, how did Haldane deal with Lysenko and with the sort of the clear evidence that emerged that Stalin was, carrying out all sorts of horrors?
Well, I think it was clearly really difficult for him, and this, there's sort of signs of an inner conflict all over his private papers. The papers that I've read. He only went to the Soviet Union once ever in 1928 for a month. And at the time, the signs of purges and show trials were not quite as evident as they were later. So there's at least sort of room to imagine that he might have been fooled. And certainly he was very impressed with the way that the Soviet state under Stalin was pushing science as the bedrock of a modern 20th century society. He was extremely pleased with the kind of funding that scientists would receive, the institutional support that they'd get to go out and pursue their research. And these were all the things that he thought were lacking in the United Kingdom. And so when it came to Lysenko, he was really in a fix, because Lysenko was denying things about the theory of genetics that Haldane had based his own work on for decades. And so, on the one hand, obviously, he didn't want to negate his own work, and he didn't believe in what Lysenko was saying. But on the other hand, I think he came to the decision that the best thing for him to do would be to defend Lysenko in public, even as he continued to argue the cause of science in private within the party. Until now, until I wrote this book, we have only ever seen him as a Lysenko defender. I think there's been nothing that's been written about how he argued with his own colleagues in the party over the need to tell the truth about Lysenko's genetics, and how that eventually led to his departure from the Communist Party of Great Britain in the early 1950s. But there was this moment of time in the late 1940s, between 1947 and 1949, when he was defending Lysenko much more staunchly than I think he thought he'd have to do, to the extent that he went on the BBC and kind of gave this, marvelously Byzantine defense of Lysenko and his genetics that sounds so hollow when you read the words now. But I think so. I think that was the one time in his life when he allowed his political integrity, to such as it was, to trump his scientific integrity. And I think it's something that he did regret much later in life.
Mm-hmm. And so you're saying that experience helped lead him towards eventually leaving the party?
I think so. I think it was almost certainly the single precipitating factor towards him leaving the party in the early 1950s. He had already started to resign from the various sort of committees and so on that he was on. He resigned from the editorial board of the Daily Worker, a publication that he edited for a long time. He stopped writing for the party. He was very wary of putting his name on a piece that would appear in the Daily Worker anymore, and eventually he just left.
Mm-hmm. And so then he goes to India, I guess, not long after this, right? Why did that? What did you? This was kind of how you got interested in Haldane to begin with. So did you learn about, what precipitated this move? I mean, had he been to India before, or was this just a sudden thing, just to totally change worlds?
Well, I mean, the shortest possible answer is the one that Haldane gave when a reporter asked him why he was moving. His answer was that 60 years in socks is enough. He looked forward to just sort of wearing no socks or shoes when he got to India. But there's obviously other reasons, and one of them was this disillusionment with the Communist Party of Great Britain, which was really his one big ideological anchor in the UK. The second was, I think he thought that India was a substitute society to look towards once the Soviet Union had sort of fallen out of favor with him. India at the time, under the first Prime Minister Nehru, was very much a model of a socialist state, a very technocratic state. Somebody who, Nehru was a man who believed in science and scientists and economists sort of planning out the economy based on what the country needed. And he really wanted to be in the thick of that. He'd already visited a couple of times on lecture tours, and he liked being there. He loved the natural world and sort of the profusion of flora and fauna and the kind of opportunities that gave him to do research. And, less sort of romantically, but perhaps, understandably, was the question of just money. I mean, I think he found that after the war, University College London, his institution at the time, was running short of funds for research, to the extent that he would sometimes have to funnel his own earnings from his writing towards his lab's income. He had to buy a set of teaspoons for the common room because the common room had none. So he was running short of funds both for himself and for his work. And he was promised a kind of salary in India that would enable him to live and work comfortably. He was paying alimony to his first wife as well. That's another sort of running thread through his personal finances. And so eventually, I think he just upped sticks and moved in 1957 to Calcutta.
And so I guess he lived for several years in India before his death. In
7 years, yes.
7 years?
1950, yes.
It seems like he was still very much, his mind was still very much, as you say, a Catherine wheel. I mean, I was really amazed when I went recently working on my own book, Life's Edge, about he hadn't stopped thinking about the origin of life. I mean, he thinks about it in 1929, and clearly he must still be thinking about it because I think it was in 1963 maybe or something like that he just takes that up again. He's going to go to a meeting and give a talk, and he basically takes what had been learned about DNA and molecular biology since then, and comes up with what we would look at now as a view of the origin of life called the RNA world, in the early 60s. I mean, I'm looking at this how does he keep doing this? It's just amazing.
Right. I mean, at a time when it had been barely a decade, I think, since Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA. And, at this conference in Florida, which I think is the one that you've been looking at as well, almost as a side note, I mean, and this is sort of quintessential Haldane, right? I mean, he gives a speech about his theory about the origin of life, but he also acknowledges extremely generously this other Russian scientist, Alexander Oparin, who came up with a theory at the same time as him. And he kind of says, I'm sure Oparin thought of it before me, and all credit should go to him. And having said all of that, he didn't just process this, this idea of that maybe the first molecule of quote unquote life to form was not DNA but RNA, and that all life eventually sort of came from that origin. And it's something that people are, as you say, kind of working on still now and coming to believe more and more.
Yeah. So, having sort of, lived in Haldane's life for all this time now, what are the things that you think are most relevant to us now? I mean, we've talked about, politics, the tension between science and politics, for example. I mean, what makes his life relevant in 2020, do you think?
Oh, where do I begin? I mean, especially in 2020, right, as opposed to 2019. Well, I mean, the pandemic is sort of a good place to base ourselves for for that question and that answer, I think. One of the things that Haldane believed was the importance of instilling scientific thinking into sort of the average member of the public. He didn't want them to be scientists. He just wanted them to know how to think scientifically, to sort of weigh evidence, to use logic, to follow a chain of thinking until you come to a conclusion that doesn't go against the established facts. And I think that is evident even more now because at a time when news and misinformation about science both equally flood the public sphere at the same time. Um, we have people advising members of the public to drink bleach. We have people advising members of the public to try untested drugs that are usually prescribed for other kinds of diseases. I think a modicum of scientific thinking in the general public would have helped hugely. But beyond that, I think it's important now more than ever to see how entangled science and politics are. I think for a brief while, I think in the 70s and the 80s, scientists managed to sort of maybe fool themselves is the wrong word, but mute their voices a little bit so that they weren't quite hollering as loudly in public as Haldane was. This has to do with a number of things. It has to do with the fact that scientists rarely study the humanities anymore. I think the ivory towers have perhaps gotten taller and more thick-walled, and funding is often dependent on companies and governments that are exactly the kind of bodies that you don't want to annoy. And so I think for a lot of these reasons, maybe except in a couple of smaller fields, I think by and large scientists lost their public voice to some extent, certainly as compared to Haldane's time. And I think that is only now starting to be recovered over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, especially as the assault on fact and truth grows ever more pronounced with every passing month. So now more than ever, I think for scientists to speak up and to kind of defend their version of what the truth is and what fact is, I think is more important than it ever has been.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's a great moment where we could maybe bring back Kai, and I'm going to take a look at the questions that people have put here in the question box. And as we're going through the questions, if people want to add more questions as well, please feel free. I don't know, Kai, if you wanted to start it with any questions that you might have.
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, no, this has been very interesting. And I have 2 questions right off the bat. First, to the biographer, I want to learn a little more about the hurdles, the special hurdles you found in writing a biography of a scientist in terms of the sources. What was like in this treasure hunt that every biographer engages in? What was the best surprise you stumbled across? Was it in an archive or an interview? And then a second question to the 2 of you. Haldane was both this fabulous scientist, but a public intellectual who spoke to the masses and he was a celebrity and he could influence people. And we today, even more so today, we live in an age of science. We're surrounded by science and technology. And yet scientists seem to be so distrusted, and they are not public intellectuals. Why the disconnect? Why don't we have public intellectuals who speak with the authority of expertise in science? And why is that not trusted?
Okay, well, the first question first, which I think is easier to answer. I think a couple of things that were difficult with this particular biography. One was, of course, to understand the science myself before I, took on the challenge of explaining it to the reader, which was difficult because I am not a trained biologist. And so it involved sort of reading for myself all the papers that he wrote, but then also talking to other scientists, reading explanations of his work. Conversations always help. And I think I was lucky that there were a number of people who were willing to help me with that. And then again, sort of, putting it down in the kind of language that a non-scientist would be able to understand. As you both know, that is never an easy task. But the second thing for me that was so difficult, because I've always been, I am still a journalist, and I tend to think of my work as consisting of meeting people and interviewing them and looking at what I can see and taking notes and describing things that I can experience. And none of those choices were available for this biography. So the question of how to bring Haldane's world alive for the reader in sort of a really vivid way was something that I was struggling with from the very beginning, and I started to find sort of workarounds for it here and there. But the biggest surprise, the biggest gift in my entire archival research phase was the set of files that MI5 maintained on Haldane for the better part of 25 years. Just really intensive surveillance of Haldane's life and correspondence and movements and conversations. I say
So
in the
they
book
thought
that
they thought he
MI5,
might they thought he might be a spy.
they thought he was a spy. They thought he was, as he drifted further and further towards the Communist Party, they were sure that he was involved in spying at some stage. I mentioned in the book that MI5 was really Haldane's first biographer. And so I drew extensively from these notes, because here we have, a first-hand account of what it was like to shadow Haldane as he went about his work and his life. And all of these files had been declassified, barely a couple of decades ago, and were available to download. The wonders of the internet, from the National Archives website for £8. A real gold mine. And I think that really sort of broke open the middle section of the book for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The question about the scientists and their standing in society today.
Carl, I'm going to let you take the lead on that one.
Yes,
well, yeah. I mean, I've one of the threads going through my career is writing about evolution, and certainly in the 1990s, I remember when I was starting out, evolutionary biologists were had become very sort of apolitical, in the sense that they thought that their place was in their laboratory, very quietly doing their science, and that it was wrong for them to say anything about what was happening in terms of evolution in society. And they somehow just trusted that everything would just sort of take care of itself. And, as a journalist, I'm just sort of taking notes and saying, I see, interesting. But, I was thinking to myself, like, I don't understand how a person can be that naive unless they're not, as Samanth was touching on, like, not really like engaging as much in sort of the reality of what's happening socially in terms of science. And then by the end of the 1990s, intelligent design which is really just creationism warmed over, was being pushed in places like Kansas. And, I think evolutionary biologists certainly started to realize that they were not working in some sort of vacuum. And they've gradually become much more engaged. But it was a slow process. I mean, I remember when I have such a vivid memory when the Kansas event happened. I would ask evolutionary biologists how they felt about this, that creationism was trying to be brought into the classroom, and they were just shocked and angry. And I'd be like, okay, and so what are you going to do about it? And it seemed like a lot of them, like after a lot of deliberations, decided that they were going to, on the website for their scientific society, they were going to put a little statement saying that they supported the teaching of evolution in school. That was it. That was it. So whatever, some association for the study of slime molds or something would have a little statement about evolution. And they thought that okay, done. We've taken care of it. We can go back into our labs and everything will be okay out there.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and since then, climate change, vaccines, it just, if you need any evidence that scientists cannot pretend that what they're doing is not a social activity, you'd have to be really willfully ignorant.
Well, is there anyone today who is a Haldane, who is a scientist and a public intellectual, and who is forcefully speaking out, defending science?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the questions that somebody turned in. Yeah. What do you think, Samanth?
Well, I mean, the person who has always sort of struck me as a very Haldane-like figure in his particular field is James Hansen, the climate scientist, who
Mm.
has, for decades now sort of been sounding the alarm about climate change and global warming, and talking to as many members of the public as will listen to him, talking to politicians, realizing that the solution for change lies as much in the political establishment as the scientific one. He's someone who springs to mind quite often. Over here in the UK, we have Adam Rutherford, who Carl you may be familiar with as well,
Sure.
a geneticist also, but somebody who is increasingly using his knowledge of genetics to shoot down ideas about eugenics. In fact, his latest book is called How to Argue with a Racist, and is targeted at the general public and really sort of completely demolishes a lot of the precepts of quote unquote scientific racism that we see around us still today. And so I do tend to think of these two people. I mean, maybe Carl, you have others in mind as well.
Well, I think that I think you can actually draw a pretty straight line from the sort of creationism wars and the kind of growing kind of climate denialism to scientists starting in the early 2000s to write blogs, which at the time were very cutting
Right.
edge, but they would be very engaged with politics and incredibly spicy language and they were just kind of cutting loose, and blogs may not quite have the importance now that they did then, but it certainly opened the way to scientists feeling much more comfortable engaging with these issues. And you had a lot of grad students back then who now have tenure, and now they're really off the leash. And so on Twitter, on social media, and just talking to journalists like us, I think there's a certain group of people who are much more see this much more as what part of their job. And I mean, bringing it back to the pandemic, there are these kind of celebrity epidemiologists now. Like there are people like, say, Mark Lipsitch at Harvard, or Bill Hanaj, and other people who just were sort of quietly going about making their very complex models of how viruses move around in societies. And now all of a sudden, like everybody wants to know what they think. Everybody's waiting for their next word. And so in a way, it's not just like who is the Haldane. It's like there are hundreds, thousands of Haldanes.
Right. I mean, I think the thing to, maybe sort of also aim for or keep in mind is that we don't really want scientists to be speaking up at a time of crisis, right? Now, you could argue that there's always a time of crisis. Crisis is never going to go away now that we have the climate crisis, upon us. But what we don't want is people talking about how vaccines work and how diseases are tracked when there's a pandemic. I think this kind of communication would need to happen all the time from a Haldane-like figure or several figures like Haldane for people to genuinely sort of get an insight into what the state of scientific thinking is.
Yeah. Someone is asking a question is just sort of one is asking, what are Samanth's thoughts on how science is taught in high schools today? How do we still teach about relevant ideas and topics and then are broken up and new ideas brought in graduate days? And there are a couple other questions just asking you about, education, because, I mean, I guess we could say that, I mean, it is important that scientists be speaking out and being eloquent about these issues and being engaged with the real political issues of their day. But, that's not enough. I mean, people need to also have a good scientific grounding.
Right. I mean, it's funny, when I was talking to a lot of friends of mine who were scientists while I was researching this book, the one thing they would inevitably tell me was that, there's scientific education they didn't think was lacking in any way. What they found intriguing, definitely compared to Haldane's time, but even compared to 40 years ago, is that when you enter university as an undergraduate and at the time that you want to go on to become a scientist, an academic, or a researcher in a particular field, you need to start thinking about that from the very first year. You need to start planning out internships and which labs you're going to work in and who you're going to talk to and, how you're going to spend your summers. All of this stuff, it's like, you start specializing earlier and earlier in your career. to the point that you're starting to think about that stuff from the very first year of university. Now that precludes a whole lot of other kinds of thinking. It precludes sort of political and historical and civic thinking. It doesn't expose you to the kind of courses that may allow you to entertain multidisciplinary ideas, figure out how the world of the liberal arts impacts the world of the sciences and vice versa. C.P. Snow saw this decades ago when he wrote the two cultures in these fields, and that has only become sort of more and more exacerbated since then, I think. So it's not so much the quality of the scientific education as the quality of all the other education that should go with it, but perhaps isn't going with it right now.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that when I talk with science graduate students, sometimes I'll teach workshops at Yale, and for graduate students who really are interested in these issues about communicating with the public, it's very difficult for them to find the opportunities and to explore that. I mean, there just isn't time. They really need to be doing experiments so they can rack up a bunch of papers, they can get published and maybe get a postdoc and then maybe get a job. I mean, it's hard to because of where all the incentives are.
And I think they understand the value of the interdisciplinary. They don't understand that some of our best scientists like Haldane and Robert Oppenheimer were people who were polymaths, who loved literature and poetry and were interested in politics, and that these other disciplines informed actually their scientific quest. And that's something that I think has been lost by what you guys are describing as the pressures on the students today.
Right. I think the scientists would scientists would argue that it's just the nature of the progress of science itself. Back when Haldane was alive, or even when Oppenheimer was alive, you could classify a lot of what they did as quote unquote basic science, as it would be described today. The era of basic science is still very much alive. You obviously need a lot of people working in those fields, but so many things have gotten so niche and specialized that if you want to work in those fields at all, you need to start funneling down into it from the very first year of university. So, it's sort of a byproduct of how science evolves and progresses, but that isn't to say that you can't buttress that kind of education with other types of instruction that broaden a student's view of the world.
And I would say with Haldane, the opposite was true too, in that it's important for people who aren't scientists to appreciate it. And Haldane did a great job of bringing that to a huge audience.
I mean, absolutely. The biggest pleasure I got in researching this book was to read the letters that he would receive from just absolute randos, people in the middle of nowhere, truck drivers in Australia, amateur horticulturists across the world, all these people who said, I've read your essay and I have something to say about this. I've been thinking about how best to protect somebody from a falling bomb. I've been thinking about how to cross these two plants in a hybrid way. I've been thinking about what you said about why cats have different colored eyes sometimes. It's just the volume of this kind of correspondence from literally the general public is astonishing. And Haldane he had the kind of energy that he would write back almost always. It wouldn't always be the polite kind of letter. I mean, he would sometimes be quite rude, but he would always write back. And it's really, that kind of energy is remarkable. But more than anything else, it just shows how successful he was in actually reaching the kind of people he set out to reach.
Great. Well, maybe that's a good place for us to stop, Kai. We talked for about an hour. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think that is a good note to end on, unless you have any other thoughts, Samanth. But let me ask you: are you working on another book? Have you?
I'm not. I'm still recovering from this one.
No more biography, yeah?
Well, not for a while. I mean, I'm no Carl Zimmer. I mean, this 2 books every 5 years and so on. This is too much for me.
I'm taking time off too.
Well, thank you both.
Thanks. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Thank you so much.
And thank you all to the audience, and thank you to the Leon Levy Foundation and Shelby White, who has been funding our activities for the last 13 years. And please go out and find a copy of Samanth Subramanian's new book, A Dominant Character. There we go. There it is. It's in the bookstores, it's on Amazon, it's in Powell's, wherever you can find online books these days. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.